For 52 years, she had no name, just a number in a file, a body in an unmarked grave, a family's unanswered prayers echoing across a continent. In 1968, when boys playing near an oil field discovered what they thought was a discarded mannequin, they uncovered one of California's most enduring mysteries. Time buried the truth deeper than any grave could hold, until science learned to speak the language of blood and bone, and the dead finally found their voice. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The rain falls steady against the windows of a modest home in Augusta, Maine, where morning light filters through lace curtains. March 9, 1942. The seventh child arrives to a family already full of love and chaos. Anita Louise Pitot enters the world with a cry that seems to promise adventure. Her mother, Rena, cradles the infant close, exhausted but radiant. Catch their first glimpse of their baby sister. Even as a newborn, something in Anita's dark eyes suggests she will not be content to stay small or stay still for long. The house fills with the sounds of a large family footsteps on wooden floors, voices calling from room to room, the clatter of dishes, and the warm hum of conversation. This will be Anita's first language, the music of belonging, of being surrounded by people who know your name. Years compress, like pages turning. Anita grows into a girl who climbs trees before she walks steady, who asks questions that make adults pause and consider. She has her mother's gentle smile, but her own restless spirit. While her siblings seem content with the rhythms of small-town life, Anita stares out windows, as if she can see something calling from beyond the horizon. At school, teachers describe her as bright and curious. At home, she's the one who disappears for hours, only to return with stories of adventures in the woods or by the Kennebec River. Her family learns to expect the unexpected from their youngest daughter. The house on the hill becomes an anchor point for a girl whose heart already understands that love doesn't require staying in one place. But for now, Augusta is enough. For now, the world beyond Maine exists only in library books and distant radio signals. Rena watches her youngest daughter grow with a mixture of pride and concern. She recognizes something in Anita, that she sees in herself a longing for experiences that small towns cannot provide. But she also knows that some hungers, once awakened, can never be satisfied. The autumn of 1967 arrives with unusual warmth, as if the world itself is reluctant to let summer go. Anita, now 25, stands at her bedroom window overlooking the familiar streets of Augusta. The same houses, the same neighbors, the same predictable rhythm of days that once felt comforting, now feels suffocating. Her decision forms slowly, like a photograph developing in solution. She has saved enough money from her job at the local diner. She has read enough magazines filled with photographs of palm trees and ocean waves. She has spent enough evenings wondering what lies beyond the boundaries of everything she has ever known. The conversation with her family unfolds over dinner on an October evening. Her siblings exchange glances when she mentions California, as if they have been expecting this moment for years. Her mother sets down her fork and studies her youngest daughter's face. Los Angeles, Anita says, the words feeling both foreign and inevitable on her tongue. I want to see what it's like to live somewhere the sun shines every day. Her father, a man of few words, nods, slowly. He has worked the same job for 30 years, lived in the same house for longer, but he recognizes the look in his daughter's eyes. It's the same expression she wore as a child when she climbed too high in trees, reached for things just beyond her grasp. The family offers practical concerns. The cost of living, the distance from home, the uncertainty of finding work in a city where she knows no one. But underneath their worries runs a current of understanding. They have all watched Anita strain against the boundaries of their small world for years. Perhaps it is time to let her fly. Letters become Anita's lifeline to home. They arrive weekly, sometimes twice a week, filled with descriptions of palm trees and sunshine, of rented rooms and new friends, of adventures that sound both thrilling and slightly reckless. Her handwriting maintains its familiar loops and flourishes, but the content reveals a woman discovering herself in ways that small-town life never allowed. February 1968 arrives with an unusual chill. Even for Maine, snow falls in thick, wet flakes that cling to windows and muffle sound. Inside the Pitot house, Anita's mother checks the mailbox with increasing anxiety. 3 weeks have passed since the last letter, 21 days of silence, from a daughter who has never let more than a week pass without sending word home. The absence of communication creates a weight in the house that everyone feels but no one wants to acknowledge. Rena spreads Anita's previous letters across the kitchen table, searching for clues she might have missed. The most recent ones speak of new friends, of evenings spent in clubs and restaurants, of a city that never sleeps. But there is nothing that suggests danger, nothing that hints at trouble. Her siblings take turns calling the telephone number Anita provided, but it rings endlessly into empty air. The landlord, when they finally reach him, says only that he hasn't seen the young woman from Maine in several weeks. Her room remains untouched, her belongings undisturbed, but she simply vanished. The local police in Augusta listen politely but offer little hope. A young woman choosing not to contact her family is not unusual, they explain. California is a big place, full of distractions and new experiences. She could have moved, changed jobs, found new friends who occupy all her time. But Rena knows her daughter. Even in the midst of grand adventures, Anita always remembered home. The silence feels wrong in ways that logic cannot explain. Days stretch into weeks. The mailbox that once brought joy now represents daily disappointment. Phone calls to California yield no new information. Anita's room remains exactly as she left it. Her childhood bed still made with the same quilt her grandmother stitched decades earlier. The family begins to fracture under the weight of not knowing. Some siblings convince themselves that Anita is simply too busy with her new life to write. Others fear something more serious has occurred. But all of them feel the absence like a physical ache, a missing piece that no amount of hope or denial can replace. Winter deepens in Maine, but the cold that settles over the Pito house has nothing to do with weather. March 14, 1968. The morning sun beats down on the oil fields of Huntington Beach with unusual intensity for early spring. The air smells of crude oil and salt water, a combination that defines this stretch of Southern California coastline where industry meets nature in uneasy alliance. 3 boys, aged 10 to 12, navigate the maze of abandoned equipment and drainage ditches that surround the oil field. They carry fishing poles and tackle boxes, heading toward a spot where they hope to catch something worth bragging about. School won't start for another hour, but adventure calls louder than the promise of arithmetic lessons. The eldest boy spots it first, a shape in the concrete drainage ditch that doesn't belong. From a distance, it looks like someone has dumped an old mannequin or scarecrow, the kind stores use to display clothes. But as they approach, details emerge that make their stomachs tighten and their voices drop to whispers. The shape has form and substance that plastic cannot replicate. It has hair that catches the morning light. It has hands that rest at unnatural angles. The boys stop walking and stare, their young minds struggling to process what their eyes are showing them. One of them whispers, "Is that real?" The question hangs in the air like smoke. They edge closer, driven by curiosity stronger than fear. The sun reveals more details: clothing torn and stained, skin that has taken on colors that belong only in nightmares. This is not a mannequin. This is not something left behind by careless workers. This is someone who was once alive, someone who laughed and dreamed and wrote letters home to family in distant places. Someone who became the victim of violence so brutal that even hardened investigators will struggle to comprehend its magnitude. The boys run. They leave their fishing poles and tackle boxes and run toward the nearest houses, their voices breaking as they try to explain what they have discovered. Adults listen with growing alarm, and within minutes, sirens wail across the oil field. Police arrive to find a crime scene that will haunt them for decades. The victim, a young woman, has suffered injuries that speak of rage and hatred beyond comprehension. Her throat has been slashed, her body bearing evidence of sexual assault and prolonged violence. But perhaps most troubling of all is what the investigators do not find. No identification, no personal belongings, no way to determine who this woman was or where she came from. She becomes, in the clinical language of police reports, Jane Doe, 1968. The Huntington Beach Police Department transforms into a hub of urgent activity as investigators begin the painstaking process of trying to identify both victim and killer. Detective arrives early and stays late, driven by a determination that colleagues will come to recognize as his defining characteristic. The evidence tells a story of violence, but offers few clues about identity. The victim's clothing provides no labels that might indicate where it was purchased. Her hands show no distinctive scars or markings. Even her dental work offers limited hope. The filling patterns suggest quality dental care, but nothing unique enough to narrow the search significantly. A bartender from a nearby establishment comes forward with a memory that briefly raises hopes. He recalls serving a young woman several weeks earlier who mentioned being from New York. She had seemed nervous, constantly checking the door, as if expecting someone. But when investigators pursue this lead, it dissolves into uncertainty. The bartender's description could match hundreds of young women, and his memory of her accent proves unreliable. Physical evidence from the scene includes tire tracks that suggest the killer drove a common model of car, shoe prints that indicate a man of average size, and a cigarette butt that investigators carefully preserve. In 1968, these items represent the cutting edge of forensic science, but they are not enough to identify a killer who has vanished as completely as his victim's identity. The sexual assault kit yields biological evidence that investigators catalog with meticulous care. Though the technology to analyze DNA still lies decades in the future, they work with the tools available to them: fingerprints, dental records, and detailed descriptions that they hope will eventually connect with missing person reports from around the country. Days pass, then weeks. No family comes forward to claim the young woman. No missing person report matches her description closely enough to provide a solid lead. The investigation, which began with such urgency, gradually slows to a methodical search through databases and records that seem to contain no answers. Detective refuses to let the case fade into the background noise of daily police work. He carries photographs of the victim in his jacket pocket, studies the evidence files during lunch breaks, and contacts missing persons units across multiple states. But the silence that surrounds Jane Doe, 1968, proves more impenetrable than any wall. October 1968 arrives with the kind of crisp autumn air that makes California residents remember why they moved west. But in the Orange County Coroner's Office, the season brings only the grim necessity of making decisions about unclaimed remains. Nearly 10 months have passed since the discovery in the oil field. The investigation has exhausted every conventional lead. No family has come forward. No missing person report has provided a match. No witness has emerged with information that might identify either victim or killer. The young woman who entered police records as Jane Doe 1968 faces a fate that investigators find almost as tragic as her murder: burial in an unmarked grave, with no family to mourn her passing, no name to mark her resting place, no one to remember who she was before violence stole her life. Detective attends the burial service, one of only 3 people present. The others are the coroner and a chaplain, who speaks words of comfort over someone whose name he does not know. The service is brief and painfully impersonal, but Detective stays until the last shovel of earth covers the simple casket. Back at the police station, the case file grows thicker, but no closer to resolution. New techniques are attempted as they become available: improved fingerprint analysis, better dental record systems, enhanced missing person networks that connect law enforcement agencies across state lines. Each advancement brings hope that briefly burns bright before fading into disappointment. The victim's fingerprints yield no matches in expanded databases. Her dental records, while clearly indicating professional care, match no missing person reports. Enhanced missing person networks produce dozens of possible matches that dissolve under scrutiny. Detective begins to understand that some cases resist solution, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because the connections that might solve them exist in places where no one knows to look. Jane Doe 1968 becomes a permanent resident of his consciousness, a reminder of the limitations that define even the most dedicated police work. The case file finds its place among other unsolved murders, but Detective ensures it remains accessible. He reviews it regularly, looking for details that previous examinations might have missed. He continues to follow up on any missing person report that bears even slight resemblance to their victim. Years begin to pass. The oil field returns to normal operations. The boys who discovered the body grow into teenagers, then adults, carrying with them a memory that will color their understanding of mortality for the rest of their lives. The late 1970s bring technological advances that investigators hope might breathe new life into cold cases. Improved fingerprint classification systems, better dental record databases, and enhanced communication between law enforcement agencies create opportunities that did not exist a decade earlier. Detective, now graying at the temples and carrying the weight of countless unsolved cases, approaches Jane Doe 1968 with renewed determination. The evidence is re-examined, using the best available technology. The fingerprints are run through expanded databases. The dental records are compared against missing person reports that have accumulated over the intervening years. Each test produces the same result: no match found. The young woman's identity remains as elusive as her killer's. The biological evidence from the crime scene is preserved carefully, waiting for technologies that do not yet exist, but that investigators hope might someday provide answers. New theories emerge and are discarded. Perhaps the victim was not American at all. but a foreign visitor whose disappearance was never reported to U.S. authorities. Perhaps she was a runaway who had been living under an assumed name. Perhaps she was someone whose family chose not to report her missing for reasons that will never be understood. Detective retires in the early 1980s, but not before ensuring that the case file is transferred to younger investigators who might bring fresh perspectives to the mystery. His farewell memo is brief but emphatic. Jane Doe, 1968, deserves to have her name restored. Don't let her be forgotten. The case becomes part of departmental folklore, the mystery that has frustrated 3 generations of investigators, the victim whose identity seems destined to remain forever unknown. New detectives review the file as part of their orientation, learning about the limitations of police work and the importance of persistence in the face of seemingly impossible odds. But the file also represents hope. Each new technological advancement is applied to the evidence. Each missing person report that bears any resemblance to the victim is carefully investigated. The case may be cold, but it is not abandoned. In local newspapers, occasional articles mark the anniversary of the discovery. 10 years later, oil field murder remains unsolved. 20 years of searching yields no answers. The headlines change, but the fundamental mystery remains constant. The 1980s pass in a blur of technological advancement and persistent frustration. Computer databases make information more accessible, but Jane Doe, 1968, remains absent from every search. Improved forensic techniques offer new ways to analyze old evidence, but the fundamental problem persists without a name or a family to compare against. Even the best science cannot provide identification. New detectives inherit the case with a mixture of determination and resignation. The file has grown thick, with reports, photographs, and correspondence from law enforcement agencies across the country. Every lead has been followed to its conclusion. Every possible connection has been explored. The victim's remains rest in their unmarked grave, visited only by investigators who refuse to let her be forgotten entirely. Flowers appear occasionally left by unknown hands that may belong to police officers, coroner staff, or citizens who have read about the case and feel compelled to acknowledge a life that ended too soon. Public interest in the case wanes as newer crimes capture headlines and demand attention. Jane Doe, 1968, becomes a historical footnote, a cautionary tale about the limitations of 1960s forensic science, a reminder that some mysteries may never find resolution. But in the police department's cold case unit, hope persists. The evidence is stored carefully in climate-controlled facilities. The reports are updated regularly as new technologies become available. The case may be decades old, but the commitment to finding answers remains undiminished. Missing person reports continue to flow in from across the country. Each one is carefully compared against the victim's description. Most are quickly eliminated, but a few generate enough similarity to warrant deeper investigation. Phone calls are made to distant police departments. Records are requested and reviewed. Families are contacted and interviewed. None produce the breakthrough that investigators seek. The young woman's identity remains as mysterious as the morning she was discovered. Her killer, if still alive, has managed to avoid detection for more than 2 decades. The case that once seemed so urgent has settled into a pattern of routine maintenance, preserved but not progressing. As the decade draws to a close, veteran investigators begin to accept what they have long feared. Some cases are destined to remain unsolved. Jane Doe, 1968, may be one of them. The new millennium arrives with promises of technological revolution that extend far beyond personal computers and internet connections. In forensic laboratories across the country, DNA analysis has evolved from experimental technique to standard investigative tool. The biological evidence preserved from the 1968 crime scene suddenly becomes more valuable than gold. What investigators could only catalog and store for 33 years can now be analyzed, compared, and potentially matched with suspects whose DNA exists in growing databases. In 2001, the evidence makes its way to a state-of-the-art laboratory where technicians extract DNA profiles from sources that would have been useless decades earlier. The victim's clothing yields genetic material. The cigarette butt, found at the scene, provides what appears to be the killer's DNA signature. For the first time since the discovery in the oil field, investigators feel genuine optimism. The DNA profiles are clear, complete, and ready for comparison against the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, a national database that contains genetic information from convicted criminals across the United States. The process requires weeks of careful preparation and analysis. Technical staff double-check their work, ensuring that contamination has not compromised the samples. The chain of custody is verified and documented. Everyone involved understands that this may represent the last, best hope for solving a case that has frustrated law enforcement for more than 3 decades. Results arrive on a Tuesday morning in late summer. The laboratory report is thorough, professional, and devastating in its clarity. The DNA profiles are excellent quality and suitable for comparison. The analysis has been conducted according to the highest standards. The genetic signatures are clear and unambiguous. No matches found in CODIS database. The killer's DNA exists in the system, waiting to be compared against future entries. But he is not among the convicted criminals whose genetic information currently populates the database. He may never have been arrested for a serious crime, or he may have committed his crimes before DNA collection became routine, or he may have died before his DNA could be catalogued. Hope transforms into familiar frustration. The case that seemed on the verge of solution settles back into cold storage, waiting for the next technological breakthrough or the next expansion of genetic databases. The CODIS database grows steadily throughout the first decade of the new century, fed by DNA collection from arrestees and convicted criminals in jurisdictions across the United States. Periodically, the genetic profile from the 1968 murder is run against new entries, but the results remain consistent. No match found. Investigators begin to accept that their killer may exist outside the criminal justice system that feeds the database. He may have lived a law-abiding life after committing murder, or he may have been careful enough to avoid arrest for subsequent crimes, or he may have died before DNA collection became standard practice. The victim's genetic profile presents a different challenge. Her DNA could theoretically be compared against missing person cases where biological samples are available, but such comparisons require specific requests and careful coordination between agencies. The process is time-consuming and often yields results that raise more questions than they answer. New detectives inherit the case with fresh perspectives but face the same fundamental obstacles. The evidence is better analyzed than ever before, but analysis means nothing without comparison samples. The genetic profiles are perfect in their clarity, but clarity cannot identify people who do not exist in searchable databases. Cold case units across the country face similar frustrations. DNA technology has solved thousands of cases, but it has also highlighted the limitations that exist when genetic profiles cannot be matched against known samples. The science is revolutionary, but it cannot create connections that do not exist in databases. Jane Doe, 1968, remains unnamed, her killer unidentified. The case file grows thicker with DNA reports and technological analyses, but the fundamental mystery persists. Science has provided tools that previous generations of investigators could not have imagined, but some puzzles require more than technology to solve. The victim rests in her unmarked grave, surrounded by the graves of others whose names are carved in stone. Her family, if they are still alive, continue to wonder what happened to their missing daughter. Her killer, if he is still alive, carries the knowledge of his crime in whatever conscience he possesses. Time passes, technology advances, hope persists. 2019 arrives with a new weapon in the forensic arsenal: investigative genetic genealogy. This revolutionary technique uses public DNA databases, populated by millions of people seeking to trace their family histories. For the first time, investigators can compare crime scene DNA against voluntary submissions from ordinary citizens, potentially identifying suspects through their genetic relatives. Genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick enters the case as a specialist in this emerging field. Her background combines traditional genealogical research with cutting-edge genetic analysis, skills that make her uniquely qualified to tackle mysteries that have frustrated conventional investigation. The genetic profile from the 1968 murder enters databases containing millions of voluntary DNA submissions. Unlike CODIS, which contains only convicted criminals, these databases include teachers and accountants, retirees and students, people who submitted their DNA simply to learn about their ethnic heritage or find distant cousins. The analysis begins with the victim's DNA. Family trees emerge from genetic connections, building outward from the crime scene evidence toward living relatives who may hold the key to identification. The process requires months of careful work, comparing genetic markers, building family structures, and following genealogical trails that often lead to dead ends. But the science works. Slowly, carefully, genetic connections emerge that point toward specific family lines. The victim's DNA matches people whose family trees can be traced, whose ancestors can be identified, whose relatives can be contacted. Phone calls begin to ring in homes across the country. Genealogical researchers explain their work to surprised family members who never expected their hobby interest in ancestry to connect them with a decades-old murder case. Some are eager to help. Others are cautious, concerned about privacy and implications they cannot fully understand. The breakthrough comes in the form of a genetic connection, strong enough to suggest close family relationship. The victim's DNA matches someone whose family tree includes a missing branch, a relative who left Maine in the 1960s and was never heard from again. The name emerges like a photograph developing in solution: Anita Louise Pitot. The confirmation process requires weeks of additional analysis, but the evidence builds systematically toward certainty. Genealogical records trace Anita's family history. Birth certificates, school records, and employment documents create a paper trail that confirms her identity and timeline. Anita Louise Pitot, born March 9, 1942, in Augusta, Maine, the youngest of 7 children, the adventurous spirit who left home for California and vanished into silence, the daughter whose family waited 51 years for answers about her fate. Law enforcement contacts the Pitot family with news that transforms decades of uncertainty into painful clarity. The phone call that arrives at a modest home in Maine carries information that family members have both dreaded and hoped for since 1968. The conversation is gentle but devastating. Yes, they have found Anita. No, she did not simply choose to start a new life somewhere else. She was murdered shortly after her arrival in California, victim of violence so brutal that detectives still struggle to comprehend its magnitude. Family members react with a mixture of grief and relief. The not knowing has been its own kind of torture, a daily uncertainty that prevented them from fully mourning their loss. Now they can grieve properly, but they must also confront the reality of how their daughter and sister died. The media attention is immediate and intense. Jane Doe identified. After 51 years, California cold case victim was missing Maine woman. DNA genealogy solves decades-old mystery. The story spreads across news outlets hungry for feel-good technology stories that demonstrate science's power to provide closure. But for the Pitot family, the attention feels intrusive. They have spent half a century learning to live with uncertainty. Now, they must learn to live with truth that is more painful than anything they imagined during their years of wondering. Anita's remains will be exhumed and returned to Maine, where she can finally rest among family members who never stopped looking for her. The unmarked grave in California will be replaced by a headstone in Augusta that bears her name and the dates that bracket a life cut far too short. The case is half solved. Anita has her name back, but her killer remains unidentified. The same genetic genealogy techniques that identified Anita Louise Pitot are applied to the killer's DNA profile with equal determination. Genealogist Fitzpatrick begins building family trees from genetic connections, following bloodlines backward through generations and forward through living relatives. The process proves more challenging than the victim identification. The killer's genetic relatives are less cooperative, more suspicious of contact from researchers investigating a murder case. Some refuse to provide additional information. Others demand detailed explanations before agreeing to participate. But the science persists through human reluctance. Genetic connections exist regardless of family cooperation. Public records provide genealogical information that supplements DNA analysis. Slowly, carefully, a family tree emerges that points toward a specific individual. The name surfaces through methodical elimination. Johnny Monroe Crisco, a U.S. Army veteran with a history of violence and mental instability. A man whose service record includes disciplinary actions and psychological evaluations that paint a picture of someone struggling with impulse control and anger management. Further investigation reveals a pattern of behavior consistent with the brutality of the 1968 murder. Crisco had been stationed in California during the relevant time period. His military records place him in the Los Angeles area when Anita Pitot was killed. His psychological profile suggests someone capable of the violence that ended her life. The breakthrough feels hollow when investigators discover a crucial fact. Johnny Monroe Crisco died in 2015, 4 years before the genetic genealogy analysis identified him as the killer. There will be no arrest, no trial, no opportunity for justice to be served in a courtroom. The case is solved, but not resolved. The killer has been identified but will never face judgment for his crime. The family has answers but not the satisfaction of seeing their daughter's murderer held accountable for his actions. District Attorney's Office prepares a public announcement that will close one of Orange County's oldest unsolved murder cases. The press conference will provide closure for investigators who have carried this burden for decades, but it will also highlight the limitations of justice delayed too long. The truth has emerged, but truth without consequences feels incomplete. The press conference takes place on a clear autumn morning at the Huntington Beach Police Department. Representatives from the District Attorney's Office, the Police Department, and the genealogy team gather before assembled media to announce the resolution of a case that has haunted local law enforcement for more than 5 decades. The announcement is factual and restrained. Anita Louise Piteau has been identified as the victim of a 1968 murder that remained unsolved until advances in genetic genealogy provided the breakthrough investigators needed. Johnny Monroe Crisco has been identified as her killer through the same scientific techniques. Questions from reporters focus on the technology that made the identification possible. How does genetic genealogy work? What other cases might benefit from this approach? Will this technique revolutionize cold case investigations? The questions about justice are harder to answer. Crisco's death means that legal accountability will never occur. The case is solved in the scientific sense, but the criminal justice system cannot provide the resolution that families and investigators typically seek. Local media coverage emphasizes the breakthrough nature of the identification, the dedication of investigators who never gave up, and the power of modern science to provide answers that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. National media picks up the story as an example of how genetic genealogy is transforming cold case investigations. The Piteau family releases a statement through their attorney. They express gratitude for the identification of their daughter and for the decades of work by investigators who refuse to let her case be forgotten. They also ask for privacy as they process information that transforms their understanding of their loved one's fate. Community reaction is mixed. Some residents express satisfaction that the mystery has finally been solved. Others feel frustrated that the killer escaped earthly justice by dying before his identification. Still, others worry about the privacy implications of genetic genealogy techniques that can identify people through their relatives' voluntary DNA submissions. The case becomes a teaching example for law enforcement agencies considering genetic genealogy approaches to their own cold cases. The success is clear, but so are the limitations when suspects die before they can be brought to trial. The media attention surrounding the case sparks broader conversations about genetic genealogy, privacy rights, and the balance between solving crimes and protecting personal information. Legal experts debate whether people who submit DNA to ancestry services understand that their genetic information might eventually be used to identify criminal relatives. Privacy advocates express concern about the expansion of genetic databases that can be accessed by law enforcement. They argue that people who submit DNA to learn about their ethnic heritage or find distant cousins never consented to participate in criminal investigations that might affect their families. Law enforcement officials counter that genetic genealogy represents a powerful tool for bringing closure to families who have waited decades for answers. They point to cases like Anita Piteau's as evidence that the technology can provide justice even when traditional investigative methods fail. The debate reflects broader tensions between individual privacy and collective security that characterize many aspects of modern life. Where is the line between acceptable law enforcement use of personal information and unwarranted intrusion into private lives? For the investigators who worked on the Piteau case, these philosophical questions feel secondary to the human reality of providing answers to a family that waited 51 years to learn their daughter's fate. The technology worked. The case was solved. A name was restored to someone who had been reduced to a number in a file. But the broader implications extend far beyond one case. Genetic genealogy has the potential to solve thousands of cold cases, but it also raises questions about consent, privacy, and the appropriate scope of law enforcement authority that society has not yet fully addressed. The Piteau case becomes a landmark in the development of investigative genetic genealogy, cited in academic papers, legal briefs, and policy debates. The technique that provided closure for one family opens new frontiers in forensic science, while simultaneously raising new questions about the price of justice in an age of genetic surveillance. The process of returning Anita's remains to Maine requires careful coordination between California and Maine authorities, funeral homes, and family members who must make decisions they never expected to face. The young woman who left Augusta in search of adventure will finally come home, but under circumstances no one could have imagined. The exhumation takes place on a quiet morning in the California cemetery, where Anita rested for 51 years. Workers carefully remove the simple casket from its unmarked grave, while investigators witness the process that will allow a daughter to be buried near her family. Transportation arrangements are handled with dignity and care. The remains make the cross-country journey by air, accompanied by documentation that traces their chain of custody from the oil field discovery through decades of storage to final identification and release. In Augusta, family members prepare for a funeral that has been delayed by more than half a century. The service will be both celebration of life and acknowledgement of loss, recognition of the young woman Anita was and mourning for the life she never got to live. Local media covers the homecoming with respect for family privacy. The story resonates with readers who followed the case through its decades of mystery and its recent resolution. There is satisfaction in knowing that Anita will rest among people who loved her, but also sadness that justice came too late to hold her killer accountable. The funeral service is private, attended by surviving family members and a few close friends who remember the adventurous young woman who left Maine with dreams of seeing the world. The service acknowledges both the joy Anita brought to their lives and the pain her loss created. Her headstone bears her name, birth date, and death date, simple facts that restore identity to someone who spent decades known only as a case number. The inscription includes a brief phrase chosen by her family: beloved daughter and sister, finally home. The grave site becomes a place where family members can visit, RT, leaving flowers and taking comfort in knowing that their loved one's story has finally been told completely. Back in Huntington Beach, investigators gather for a moment of quiet reflection on a case that has defined careers and tested the limits of forensic science. The conference room that once hosted strategy sessions about Jane Doe, 1968, now serves as the setting for final documentation of a solved case. Detective, now retired but still invested in the outcome, reviews the evidence files one last time. The photographs, reports, and analysis documents tell the story of 5 decades of persistent investigation. Each technological advancement brought new hope. Each disappointment reinforced the mystery's stubbornness. The case represents both triumph and limitation of police work. The victim has been identified, the killer named, but traditional notions of justice, arrest, trial, conviction, punishment could not be achieved because time intervened. Crisco died before science could connect him to his crime. For younger investigators, the case offers lessons about persistence, about the importance of preserving evidence even when solutions seem impossible, about the ways that advancing technology can breathe new life into seemingly hopeless investigations. The evidence is transferred to archival storage, where it will remain available for any future legal proceedings, though none are expected. The case file, once a source of frustration and obsession, becomes a testament to the power of persistence and advancing science. Team members who worked on various aspects of the investigation over the decades share memories of breakthrough moments and crushing disappointments. Each person contributed something essential to the eventual solution, even when their individual efforts seemed to lead nowhere. The case closure brings professional satisfaction, but also a sense of emotional exhaustion. Investing decades of effort into one unsolved murder takes a psychological toll that resolution can ease but not entirely heal. The investigators have lived with Anita's story for so long that solving it feels both triumphant and melancholy. There is recognition that genetic genealogy represents a new era in cold case investigation. Cases that seemed permanently unsolvable may now yield to techniques that were science fiction when the crimes were committed. The technology offers hope for other families waiting for answers about missing loved ones, but there is also acknowledgement that some aspects of justice cannot be recovered. Anita's killer will never face trial, never be held publicly accountable for his crime, never provide answers about his motives or methods. The case is solved, but not complete. The final report runs hundreds of pages, documenting every lead pursued, every technique attempted, every breakthrough achieved. It will serve as a reference for future investigators working similar cases, a roadmap for applying genetic genealogy to decades-old crimes. The Orange County District Attorney's Office prepares a comprehensive public statement that will formally close the case and provide information to media outlets covering the story. The announcement must balance public interest in the case details with respect for the victim's family and the limitations of posthumous justice. The statement outlines the timeline of the investigation, from the 1968 discovery through decades of conventional police work to the recent genetic genealogy breakthrough. It emphasizes the dedication of multiple generations of investigators who refuse to let the case be forgotten. Technical details about the genetic genealogy process are explained in language accessible to general audiences. The statement describes how public DNA databases enabled the identification, how family trees were constructed from genetic connections, and how traditional genealogical research confirmed the scientific findings. The announcement acknowledges the bittersweet nature of the resolution. Justice has been served in the sense that truth has emerged and identity has been restored, but legal accountability could not be achieved because the killer died before his identification. Media response is immediate and widespread. The case becomes a featured story on national news programs, highlighting both the specific details of Anita's murder and the broader implications of genetic genealogy for cold case investigations. True crime podcasters and documentary producers express interest in telling Anita's story in greater detail. The case offers compelling elements: a decades-long mystery, breakthrough science, family tragedy, and questions about privacy and justice that resonate with contemporary audiences. The Pitot family carefully considers media requests, ultimately deciding to participate selectively in projects that they believe will honor Anita's memory and raise awareness about genetic genealogy's potential to help other families find closure. Public reaction reflects the complex emotions that surround cold case resolutions. There is satisfaction that the mystery has been solved, sympathy for the family's long ordeal, and frustration that the killer escaped traditional justice by dying before his identification. The broader impact of the Pitot case extends far beyond Orange County as law enforcement agencies across the country take note of genetic genealogy's potential to solve their own cold cases. Training programs emerge to teach investigators how to work with genetic genealogists, how to navigate privacy concerns, and how to manage family expectations when cases are reopened after decades. Legal frameworks struggle to keep pace with technological capabilities. Courts must determine the admissibility of genetic genealogy evidence. Legislators debate privacy protections for DNA databases, and law enforcement agencies develop policies for accessing genetic information. The case becomes a reference point in academic discussions about forensic science, criminal justice, and privacy rights. Law schools use it as a teaching example. Police academies include it in training curricula. Medical ethicists cite it in debates about genetic privacy. For the investigators who worked on the case, recognition comes in various forms. Professional awards acknowledge their persistence and innovation. Media interviews allow them to explain their methodology and advocate for genetic genealogy's broader application to cold cases. But the most meaningful recognition comes from other families whose cold cases have been solved using similar techniques. Letters arrive from grateful relatives who found closure after decades of uncertainty. Phone calls come from investigators who successfully applied genetic genealogy to their own unsolved murders. The ripple effects continue to spread. Cold case units receive increased funding to pursue genetic genealogy investigations. Private laboratories develop specialized services for law enforcement agencies. Technology companies create tools designed specifically for investigative genetic genealogy applications. Anita's case becomes part of a larger revolution in forensic science that promises to transform cold case investigations. The techniques that identified her and her killer will likely solve thousands of similar cases in coming years, bringing closure to families and justice to victims who were previously beyond the reach of conventional investigation. Professional conferences dedicated to genetic genealogy begin featuring the Pitot case as a success story that demonstrates the technique's potential while also highlighting its limitations. Genealogist Fitzpatrick presents the case methodology at academic gatherings, law enforcement seminars, and public forums designed to educate communities about this emerging investigative tool. The presentations emphasize the meticulous nature of genetic genealogy work, how months of analysis were required to build family trees, verify connections, and eliminate false leads. The science is sophisticated, but it requires human expertise to interpret genetic connections and construct genealogical relationships. Law enforcement agencies develop protocols for genetic genealogy investigations that balance investigative needs with privacy protections. Policies emerge governing when the technique can be used, how genetic information must be handled, and what safeguards protect the privacy of innocent family members whose DNA helps identify criminal relatives. The success of the Pitot case leads to increased funding for cold case units across the country. Police departments that had relegated unsolved murders to storage rooms begin reopening investigations, applying genetic genealogy to evidence that had been collected decades earlier, but never successfully analyzed. Training programs proliferate as demand grows for investigators who understand genetic genealogy principles. The field becomes increasingly specialized, requiring knowledge of both traditional police work and cutting-edge genetic science. Public awareness of genetic genealogy's investigative applications grows through media coverage of successful cases. People who previously submitted DNA to ancestry services begin to understand that their genetic information might eventually help solve crimes involving their relatives. Some individuals request removal of their DNA from public databases, concerned about privacy implications they had not previously considered. Others explicitly consent to law enforcement use of their genetic information, hoping to contribute to justice for crime victims. The debate over genetic genealogy reflects broader tensions between individual privacy and collective security that characterize modern society's relationship with technology. In Augusta, Maine, a small memorial garden is established near Anita's gravesite, funded by donations from people who followed her story and wanted to honor her memory. The garden includes plants native to both Maine and California, symbolizing the journey that took her far from home and the technology that finally brought her back. Local high school students adopt the garden as a service project, learning about Anita's story while maintaining the plants and keeping the memorial space beautiful. The project becomes an annual tradition that ensures her story will be remembered by future generations. The garden includes a small plaque that tells Anita's story. In simple terms, a young woman who sought adventure, found tragedy, but was not forgotten by investigators who worked for decades to restore her identity and bring her home. The memorial emphasizes hope rather than despair, celebrating the persistence that eventually brought answers. Visitors to the garden include family members, former investigators, and strangers who learned about Anita through media coverage of her case. The space provides a place for reflection on the fragility of life, the importance of not giving up on unsolved mysteries, and the power of science to provide closure, even across vast spans of time. The memorial becomes a focal point for discussions about unsolved cases throughout Maine. Other families with missing loved ones visit the garden, finding comfort in Anita's story and hope that advancing technology might eventually provide answers to their own questions. Educational programs use Anita's story to teach students about forensic science, genetic genealogy, and the importance of persistence in seeking truth. The case demonstrates how individual tragedy can contribute to broader scientific advancement that helps other families find closure. The garden changes with the seasons but remains a constant reminder that some stories, no matter how long they remain untold, eventually find their voice through the dedication of people who refuse to let truth stay buried. The final chapter of Anita's story unfolds not in dramatic courtroom scenes or triumphant arrests, but in quiet moments of remembrance and reflection. Her grave in Augusta bears fresh flowers placed by family members who can finally visit a specific location to honor their daughter and sister. The investigators who worked on her case carry satisfaction mixed with melancholy. They solved the mystery that haunted their careers, but the solution came too late for traditional justice. The killer escaped earthly accountability, leaving only scientific certainty about his identity and his crime. The case file that once represented frustration and obsession now serves as a teaching tool for new generations of investigators. The methodology that identified Anita and her killer will be applied to thousands of other cold cases, bringing closure to families who have waited decades for answers. Genetic genealogy continues to evolve, becoming more sophisticated and more accessible to law enforcement agencies. The techniques that seemed revolutionary when applied to Anita's case are becoming routine tools in the forensic scientist's arsenal. But the human elements of the story remain constant: families who love missing members enough to wait decades for news, investigators who refuse to let cases be forgotten, and communities that hold space for stories that demand to be told, even when the telling comes 50 years too late. Anita Louise Pitot is no longer Jane Doe 1968. She has her name back, her identity restored, her story complete. The young woman who left Maine seeking adventure became the victim of unspeakable violence, but she also became the catalyst for scientific advances that will help countless other families find the answers she had to wait half a century to receive. The oil field where her body was discovered has been developed into residential neighborhoods. New families live where Anita died, most unaware of the tragedy that once unfolded there. But in Augusta, her memory lives on in a garden that blooms each spring, tended by students who know her story and honor her journey. Time moved forward without her, but it also carried her home.